So we're talking about equity and transportation decision making. So I want to remind you of the overall sort of project process, or overall the planning process for any infrastructure. It's plan, fund, design, build, and maintain. And we know this process, generally speaking. Planning is setting goals and figuring out transportation systems are needed. Write the plans, and then you fund it. And different agencies get involved in this. Planning and funding, maybe the MPOs get involved more. And then in design and build, maybe the DOTs and the cities, with the help of consultants and construction companies in design and build. And then maintaining the infrastructure is probably the city Department of Transportation. And then sort of you can think of this almost like a cyclical process. And what we're trying to see here is that how could potentially equity questions come into play at different stages? I think although we're mostly going to talk about planning and funding, but definitely in terms of maintenance as well, the equity process comes into play. So planning, funding, and especially the maintenance part, those are the key points where the equity questions need to be considered very, very carefully. Hopefully, equity questions are not as critical when you're doing the design build process, but definitely in planning, funding, and maintenance, that's where equity questions are of critical importance. Relevant laws and regulations. So this is important for us to know, also because obviously these laws govern our planning processes, our design processes, our maintenance processes, a lot of these things. So I think there are three sort of broad regulations that are in play here. One is the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and then Title VI, this is the Civil Rights Act, Title VI, and then the environmental justice. Those are mostly guidelines. They're based on an executive order. So they're mostly just guidelines. Then who must follow? ADA, obviously, state and local governments and all public organizations. Title VI, state and local governments that receive grants, governmental organization that receive any kind of federal assistance, and any organization really that receives any kind of federal funding has to follow Title VI. And then Title VI is basically, that's where the public involvement in the planning process becomes critical. And what are agencies supposed to do to make sure that they are abiding by these regulations? So accessible building, buses, trains, and so this is an equity issue, by the way. So I listed the ADA out here because that should remind you that making sure that you're adhering to the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, it's an equity issue because our transportation system is not in fact designed for people with disabilities. They still have considerable difficulty navigating. And this is proven by the fact that if you look at the amount of trips made by people who are unemployed, let's say the people who are not working, and if you look at the number of trips made by people who are disabled versus people who are able-bodied, there is a significant difference between the amount of trip that an able-bodied unemployed person makes versus a disabled unemployed person makes, right? And that difference is partly because a lot of travel demand that the disabled people have is not being met with the transportation systems that we are currently providing. So this is an equity issue, absolutely, and that's why we at least make that minimum requirement with the ADA. But I hope that agencies are trying to follow those universal design principles where they're not just merely meeting the ADA, but sort of are going beyond that. And then Title VI is about public involvement in the planning process. And I'm going to talk about how we used to do planning. It's called the DAD process. Decide, announce, and then defend your plans. But that process is not something we no longer want to follow. And because federal government provide dollars for most of the transportation projects, Title VI becomes a very important regulation that makes sure that the public involved planning process is undertaken. And then the environmental agency justice, that's a mere executive order. So that's why it doesn't have the same force of law. So only federal agencies have to follow it. And then it also requires meaningful public participation and environmental justice guiding principles. So the DOT has announced that. And I think those principles, even though they started out as an executive order, I think they are becoming more and more mainstream. So I think even when there is a change of control in the federal government, I think those guidelines are becoming the norm, so to speak. So I think they're less prone to sort of change because of the change in the political winds. And that's a good thing, I think, over in the scheme of things. We do want to address those equity questions through the environmental justice type considerations. So that was the legal framework of why we should study this and why the agency should care about it. But here's the thing, why you want to care about it is that consideration of equity helps make sure that all communities share the benefits, as well as the negative impacts of transportation in a fair and equitable way. And as I said before, that has not always been the case. And that has actually made our problems worse and make the equity issue more daunting than it would otherwise be. And then, so it's a critical issue, but as a matter of, it being a very challenging issue, it's a very challenging issue as well. Academically speaking, it's not a straightforward process. Let me put it that way. It's a very difficult process because there are several types of equities to consider, many potential impact, various way of categorizing measuring the impacts, and then many possible ways to categorize the affected populations. So it's a very important issue, but it's also intellectually very challenging. So that's why we want to study it, because it's fun in terms of being very challenging, but it's also very important. So both ways you would want to study equity in decision making. Okay, so I'm going to talk a lot about what types of equity, what potential impacts we should consider, and then what are the various ways of measuring the impact, and then what are the possible ways of categorizing the populations. So we'll talk about all of that first, and then we'll kind of focus in on one particular aspect of funding, because those are most relevant to this class. So potential impact to consider, potential impact of transportation decisions, the quality of transportation available, of course, right? If you cannot drive, then you cannot interact with people. In a lot of communities, that is the case. If you don't have a car or access to a car, you're very limited, severely limited. Your mobility is quite limited, especially in this country. Transportation facilities, activities, and services impose various indirect and external costs. For example, congestion delay and crash risk imposed on other road users. So these are your sort of third-party externalities. We talked about congestion pricing to address that. Infrastructure costs not funded through the user fees. So you're basically taxing people either through sales taxes or through other things. Pollution, for example, if you live near an airport, you will be feeling the brunt of the air noise pollution. And then undesirable land use impacts. So you might, if you have factories and so forth, and you have a lot of trucks. So people in the Inland Empire, for example, they're severely impacted by the truck traffic that goes to and from the port of Los Angeles and Port of Long Beach. So that's an undesirable land use impact of transportation. And that's borne primarily not by the people who live in Hollywood or who live in Malibu or whatever. It's borne by people who live in the Inland Empire, right? So they are more economically disadvantaged, and they bear the brunt of this problem. Transportation expenditure represent a major share of most household, business, and government expenditures. So it's a big cost on the households. They require significant public resources. So if you allocate them in an inequitable way, you're basically favoring some people over others. Planning decisions can affect development location and type. So for example, high-speed rail, where it would go through, where it would go, it will not. That can impact some local economic activities. And then employment and economic development, that have huge distributional impacts and very disparate type of impact, right? So planning decisions can affect employment and economic development quite a bit. So all of these are potential economic impact or equity impact of the transportation decisions. And that's why it makes it very, very interesting and critical to study equity in transportation decisions. So now let's talk about categorization of equity. Now, I'm going to borrow something from the political debates, and I don't know if you follow those things very closely, but if you are of the more sort of, maybe sort of traditional conservative or even a little bit of a libertarian perspective, you might think about, you might want to focus on equity of opportunity rather than focusing on equity of outcome. So if you think about, so these are the political debates that happen, right? So there's people on sort of the right side of the spectrum, they want to focus more on the equity of opportunity versus maybe people on the more left liberal side, they might be arguing a little bit about towards equity of outcome. But I think transportation perspective, because if you don't have good transportation, you cannot access good education, you don't have employment, and you don't have access to social, network, because you might not be able to visit your friends or family. So I would argue that because lack of adequate transportation hinders your access to education, employment, social connections, everything, I feel like equity in transportation, it's about equity of opportunity. So even if you take the more sort of conservative view that we want equity of opportunity and not necessarily equity of outcome, I think you should be supportive of equity in the transportation decision-making, because adequate transportation is in fact access to opportunity. Because if you take that away, if you cannot have access to reliable transportation, you are in fact hampering people's ability to access things. So you're taking away that opportunity from people. And that's why I hope even the most conservative people among us can agree that equity in transportation is about equity of opportunity. And that's why I hope that more people can find common ground on this. So that's one way of categorizing equity of opportunity versus equity of outcome. And our argument is that equity of opportunity is where it's at in terms of transportation decision making. So that's what we're targeting here. But there is another way of categorizing equity, which is sort of horizontal versus vertical. In horizontal equity, we are more concerned about public resources be allocated equally to each individual or group unless a subsidy is specifically justified. So this is where, when you talk about horizontal equity, you're talking about, toll roads, for example, like user fees, financing not based on general sales tax measure, but based on toll roads, based on the use of the facility, unless there is a subsidy justification because you are serving a particular type of population that has been traditionally underserved or traditionally excluded from opportunities. Unless you can justify subsidies on those grounds, you make sure that you're allocating public resources carefully. And then vertical equity is about distributional justice, is that you make sure that, so this is kind of about, specifying a subsidy for based on the mobility needs and the ability. So this is where ADA related compliance might come into play with respect to mobility needs and ability. And then with respect to income and social class, this is where you provide more subsidies to poor people and people Maybe you let them have a lower toll road, or maybe you pay them back some of the toll that they might have paid. So that's the question. So when you're talking about distributional impacts, you're talking about vertical equity. And when you're talking about public resources, you allocate them equally to each individual or group, that's the horizontal equity. So I'm going to give you some specifics about these horizontal and vertical equity questions, and then you get some better sense of it. So here are some equity goals with regards to horizontal equity and vertical equity. So horizontal equity with regards, and by the way, this is this lecture is based on one article, Littman 2021, and I'm going to give you the reference to that. With regards to all of this lecture is coming from that big paper that, not quite a paper, but a report that the Littman 2021, and I'll give you the full reference and the full report in your Canvas page, so you'll be able to access that. So horizontal equity goals are: external costs are minimized and compensated, all groups are effectively involved in decision making, and all groups receive comparable shares of public investment and resources. So that's your horizontal equity. And then vertical equity with respect to income is about affordable modes are favored over more expensive modes. So affordable modes will be public transportation, bicyclists, pedestrians. So you want to favor those modes if you're talking about vertical equity. Low-income residents can access basic services and activities. Low-income travelers receive price discounts or exemptions from tolls, for example. And then vertical equity with respect to ability and need would be universal design. So this is where accommodations for disabled people come in, basic accessibility, disadvantaged groups can access basic services and activities, and special policies and programs support and protect disadvantaged groups. So, there are some interesting things that are happening right now. And interesting not because I think they're going to be successful, but interesting because, we're trying these things. So one thing that I noticed was that there is a research project that's ongoing right now, where, and I think this is happening in the Bakersfield area. And in Bakersfield, what they're trying, in Bakersfield in Central California, what they're trying is, they're trying to provide some transportation dollars to a number of individuals. So a sample of individuals, I think maybe a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand people in the Bakersfield area. And they're giving them vouchers for transportation, and they can use them any way that they want. So I think you have to be carless individual. You cannot own a car. But if you don't own a car, they give you that money. And then you can take the bus with that money. You can even use Uber, Lyft. And they're tracking those individuals before and after they had that access to that subsidy. And they're trying to measure how much additional opportunities do you have access to. Now, I like this initiative. I like the overall idea. Now, although I'm not sure how successful it would be in terms of the context that they're trying in. Because if you know about Bakersfield, it's a very, very sort of car-oriented development, right? So if you know about Bakersfield, it's a city that's very, very car-oriented, very, very automobile-oriented. So not a lot of transit services, not a lot of accessible, dense development there. And I think what would happen is that even with the subsidies, they might not see a great amount of achievement in the goal, or even if they do see improvement, that's going to be very expensive, because the only mode that can meaningfully advance the opportunities that you have to travel, they would be based on, using Uber and Lyft and very, very car-centric type things. So that's kind of, but it's interesting nevertheless, because it's being tried right now. So my question to you is are you able to differentiate in these sort of categorizations of equity, horizontal, vertical with respect to income, and vertical with respect to ability and need. Does that make sense to you? Any questions around that? So I'm going to pause for a second. I'm going to ask you, are there any questions? Okay. So now let's talk about strategies for achieving horizontal equity. So one thing that you want to do, because one of the ways to achieve horizontal equity is that you have a very detailed public involvement plan where you can improve, you can incorporate people, include people who maybe don't speak English, who don't have time to come to a public meeting, because that's been one of the challenges of our sort of public involvement requirement, is that a lot of affluent, retired type people sort of have an even more disproportionate share, and a single mom who maybe works, in the daytime, it's hard for them to be able to attend those public meetings, even though they might have opinions about transportation. Their opinions are hard to get heard. So obviously we don't want to have that old dad approach, which is a decide, announce, defend approach. But we want to have a well thought out public involvement plan that outlines the process of involving all members of the public. So maybe providing virtual meeting options and having some accessible transportation, doing it at maybe at libraries, or doing it during the story hours at libraries, so coordinating your public involvement process with story hours at the library, right? Because they sometimes do these programs for little kids. So maybe kids can be part of the story hours, and then maybe parents can be part of the public meeting nearby, providing childcare at those events, those kind of things. So, and in the scheme of things, the cost is not very high to provide these things, and it can really help you achieve that horizontal equity. And fuller cost recovery, so user fees such as fuel taxes and tolls, increase to reflect the cost effect. So fuel taxes could be increased to fund a greater portion of roadway cost, and then more parking facilities should be priced instead of free parking. Weight distance fees that reflect roadway cost imposed by a vehicle class, so maybe truck-only tolls or truck-based tolls. Congestion pricing, that's a mechanism for horizontal equity. Charge directly for road use. Parking cash out, allow commuters to choose cash instead of subsidized parking. So if let's say, you charge, or for example, Cal Poly, we have very subsidized parking, like we pay as faculty members, our union negotiates that in the contract, that we only pay like $12 a month for parking spot. And that's ridiculously cheap. I mean, I think the students pay way more. And then faculty were supposed to be this progressive body, but we fight tooth and nail. And I say we because, I am part of the union after all. So we as a faculty union fight tooth and nail about free parking or very cheap parking on campus. But, what will be better is that if we could cash out our parking and we didn't have to, instead of, getting parking as our, benefit. So the difference between parking, so maybe you can pay more expensive parking or you can get cash instead. So I think if given that option, I think there'll be a lot fewer driving. Vary rates to reflect how costs vary by location, time, and vehicle type. Distance-based vehicle, so this is like VMT-based insurance and registration fees. So this is something that's people are trying. I think in Oregon, they trying that vehicle mile-based registration costs, which converts fixed costs into variable cost with respect to annual vehicle travel. So that all of these measures help achieve some semblance of horizontal equity, so that the cost of the infrastructure fall on the people who use it more. Environmental taxes and emission fees. So this is kind of accounting for that external cost that you impose on society when you drive your own car and so forth. So these are some of the strategies to achieve horizontal equity. I hope that kind of clears the questions around horizontal equity a little bit more. Any questions about this? So some equity metrics and typologies, obviously we talked about, and then you have some ways of achieving vertical equity, transportation affordability, housing affordability, impacts on low income communities, fair structures and discount, industry employment service quality in lower income communities, and then universal design, special mobility services, disabled parking, service quality for non-drivers. All of these are types of equity and strategies to achieve those types of equity. Some impacts, public facilities and services, user costs and benefits. So these are all impacts. And then measurement, you want to make those measurements per capita. You want to make those measurements per capita, and then travel unit, per vehicle miles, per vehicle kilometer, per passenger miles per kilometer. And then you could do per dollar user fees. So these are some of the measurement ways. And then categorization, you can categorize the user. So this is, these four things are what I talked about in terms of challenges. If we go back, what makes the study of transportation equity challenging is that because there are several types of equity, many potential impacts to consider, and many ways to measure impact, and many ways to categorize population. That's what I'm trying to get at in this slide, where I'm talking about the equity metrics and typologies. Okay, so this is like, where you can trip type, industry, mode users, location, ability, income class, demographics. So different populations come into play here. So all of these things are important. All of these population groups are important to consider as well. Now, we talked about some strategies to achieve equity. And there is one way to categorize them. It's called categorical solutions and structural changes. So there are two types of solutions that you could do to address equity. One is categorical solutions. And categorical solutions are basically, you provide special protection and services to clearly defined disadvantaged groups, right? So this is people with disabilities, income below the threshold. So that's what we do in the vertical sort of equity paradigm. We try to make sure that these special classes of people that have been traditionally excluded from transportation services or have been severely disadvantaged in the way that we've made decisions. So we pick those groups and we make sure that we provide services specifically for lower income people or people with disabilities. And that might feel like, you're doing something, and that's important as well. But I think there is another way of making changes and achieving equity in decision making, which is the structural changes that affect overall policy and planning activities. So for example, if we can somehow increase the transportation system diversity by making sure that we have improved walking, bicycle, taxi, and public transit modes, and we have more affordable transportation modes, then even without targeting a particular class of people, you might be improving the situation for everybody. And still the benefits will disproportionately go to those lower income individuals, okay? So now many programs that agencies undertake to achieve equity include both of these types of solutions. Categorical solutions that target special classes of people, plus the structural changes, okay? But many programs involve a combination of both. But now let's think about which approach is more effective. So an example of that is, think about demand responsive bus services for people with disabilities versus having an infrastructure where the disabled people can drive if they want to, if they choose to, but they have more accessible sort of walkways, pathways, where the slopes are there and not stairs necessarily. Sidewalks are well maintained, and the development is such that you can access shops and restaurants and public transit in a disabled friendly way, versus having a demand response bus services. I'm not saying you have to choose one or the other. You could obviously have sort of a paratransit service and a transportation system overall. But if you were thinking about one or the other, which one do you think is more effective in the long run? A demand responsive paratransit or an overall transportation system that provides, accessible bus services, that provides accessible walkways, accessible sidewalks, and so on and so forth? Which approach do you think is more effective if you're picking one from the other? Go ahead, pause it. So my question for you is, which approach is more effective? A categorical approach where you have a demand responsive bus service or paratransit service for people with disabilities, or you have a multimodal system that provides accessible sidewalks, accessible bus services, frequent bus services, somewhat dense development where things are close to each other. You're not having to drive 5 miles. So yeah, so one response that I've received is that structural thing is more effective in the long run, and that is the right answer. And I want to point out that this is not to say that you only can have one or the other. You can have both in place, but in the long run, the structural approaches will probably yield more benefit, even though they're not as focused. Yeah, so that is correct. The structural approaches will work better, even though they're going to be harmful. And in fact, in terms of cost, the demand responsive services are very, very expensive to run. Serving one disabled individual based on their call is very, very critical, right? I mean, it's a very, very critical, but very, very expensive service to run. But and structural processes might cost a little bit at the end, but I think they make the transportation system more affordable in the long run. So that's basically the idea of categorical versus structural solution. Maybe structural solutions are more equitable and more effective in the long run. And then another way of looking at the structural change will be mobility versus accessibility-based planning. We've done mobility-based planning for the longest time, where we looked at the roadway level of service, and anytime roadway level of service went down, we went ahead and added lanes, and added turn lanes, and made our roadways wider and wider. But what is the impact of that on users who are not driving? They're now having to cross wider roads. They're more vulnerable on the road because people are driving fast on the road. So if you can do more accessibility-based evaluation, where you're making sure that more people can access. So I think focusing on speed prioritizes that we are prioritizing the movement, right? But movement is not the primary goal of the transportation system, right? Movement is something that we have to do. Remember, transportation demand is a derived demand. We've talked about this because it's not something you don't travel because you want to travel, like just like that. You want to be a place. You go there because you have some certain attraction of that place where you're going to undertake some activity. Now, if you can make that activity more accessible, that should be the goal, and not necessarily far apart activities that you try to speed up people. So I think that's the question there. So if you can do more accessibility-based evaluation, it can consider equity impacts for all users rather than just focusing on the roadway level of service that only favors the faster modes. So they favor the motorists over the non-drivers. Okay? That's something to consider. So so that's another, like if you provide that system, that will be a structural example, or an example of a structural change. Now, equity analysis, what type of data might be required? So I think one thing that could be, one type of data that could be very useful for this is the spatial data. So maybe information that we get from the geographic and information systems that we can organize via GIS. So there is that PCAS approach, production, exchange, and consumption allocation, model activity. Basically, you look at a regional model, regional planning model, and then you look at where the production, exchange, and consumption allocation is happening. And then you could use that to evaluate the equity impacts of various land use and transportation policies. So for example, you could look at how much more benefit the lower socioeconomic status folks might derive if you improve the transit system. If you improve walkability of your infrastructure. You could look at, so spatial analysis can be used to study the travel activity as categorized by the social economic status. So what rich people are doing in terms of their travel activity versus what the poor folks are doing. And then how can we make sure that the poor folks have similar opportunities to travel and undertake some of these activities? And how do we do that? So maybe studying the travel activity of folks in a geographically coherent way is one way to do that. And then you could look at VMT reduction goals. So what's going to be the impact of that? Are we, when we do VMT reduction goals, we have to make sure that the goals that are not being achieved at the expense of people's travel opportunities, especially for the lower income folks. And then another question could be road pricing versus sales tax. So for example, who is paying more under each of these sort of funding mechanisms, right? So if you look at the road pricing where user pays versus sales tax, which are more broad-based, and there have been some studies, some research that shows that if you finance your transportation infrastructure with sales tax rather than user-based fees, that's a little bit more regressive, because under lower income, under the sales tax measures, lower income drivers pay more. So that spatial analysis can help us do that. Who pays more sales tax versus who will pay more under the road pricing mechanisms. So we can look at that equity impact through a spatial analysis. So that's one way of sort of looking at that disparate impact. So here are some equity indicators broadly categorized by increased access to mobility, affordability, accessibility, efficiency, reliability, and safety, and then reduced air pollution, air quality, and health impacts. Again, GIS would be very critical with that. Greenhouse gas emissions, total vehicle travel, less is better. So less automobile travel is better. And then enhance economic opportunities. So connectivity to different destinations, fair labor practices, transportation-related employment opportunities. People have access to that, and inclusive local business and economic activity. So that means you're reaching to more people. People are incentivized to spend money in the local communities and so forth. So these are some of the equity indicators that you could look at for the transportation decisions that you make. So this is the last one. So you could see some. So first column in this one is the treat everybody first two columns really are about horizontal equity. Last three columns are about sort of more vertical equity. First one with regards to income, first and third with regards to income-based groups, and then the second one is about the disadvantaged population. So first two columns relate with the horizontal equity. The last three columns relate with the vertical equity that I talked about. And it kind of, these crosses sort of fill up. Direct user charges for road and parking pricing, they basically are related with horizontal equity. Distance-based insurance and registration fees, they're related with both horizontal and vertical, because they can make sure that the people bear the cost that they impose, but then it can also help improves the basic access. Increased transportation system diversity, that's primarily used that's primarily based on vertical equity, because typically if you're going to improve the diversity, you're going to probably end up subsidizing some of the modes like bus fare and so forth. And then that way, that would kind of move you away a little bit from the horizontal equity and push you towards more vertical equity side of things. So that's why you could see the last three crosses are filled up. More accessible land use and location efficient development, that's also vertical equity. More affordable automobile options like car sharing, needs-based discount, again, vertical equity related. So if you do planning and investment reform, correct policies that favor automobile travel over other modes. So correct policies meaning you make corrections to the policy, okay? So I'm not saying that the policies that favor automobile travel are correct. I'm saying if you correct those policies, if you apply corrections to the policies, so those are related to both horizontal and vertical equity, improving public involvement in transportation, both horizontal and vertical again, and then improve data collection. Again, it can help us achieve both horizontal and vertical equity. So remember, the first two are related to horizontal equity. The last three are related to vertical equity, and you can categorize which of these strategies. So you should be able to think of a strategy and relate it with what type of equity objective does that achieve. Okay. Any questions?